wagging its tail. Back then, in Stalin's day, that cat wouldn't have lived very long here. It would have been eaten because people were so desperately hungry. One other man who blew the whistle on Stalin's Great Famine, Gareth Jones, a Welsh journalist and brilliant linguist. His niece, Margaret Cyril Colley, explains how Jones got the scoop of his life.
Because he spoke Russian fluently, he managed to go to a station outside Moscow and go on a peasant's train, on a third-class train, to Ukraine. He got off the train just before the border of Ukraine, because people weren't allowed to cross into Ukraine, and he walked along the railway and he met peasants, he spoke to them. He was apprehended by the secret police during this period when he was interviewing peasants, and he was then taken to Kharkov, where he saw the famine. He saw the thousands of people queuing for bread outside a shop.
Jones reported on what he'd seen in the Ukraine fearlessly. Back in Moscow, Tyranny made him out to be a liar. 2 years later, Jones went to China. His driver and tour guide, it later came out, were agents for Stalin's secret police, the NKVD. Jones was killed in mysterious circumstances. Stalin's revenge? That's hard to discover, because the Kremlin today is run by Vladimir Putin, former secret policeman, and a man eager to rewrite history in Stalin's favour, which is why the new history book in Russian schools dismisses the famine in one paragraph. What did Donald Rayfield make of the charge that Stalin had Jones killed?
It isn't proven, but it's very possible, and perhaps somewhere in the files in Moscow the evidence will be found. One interesting thing is that these useful idiots, if they proved to be not so useful, did meet their deaths rather early.
The files in all these cases, and Gareth Jones too, they'll be in the NKVD files.
Yes, I'm sure. They haven't been opened yet.
Why haven't they been opened yet?
Because basically the same organisation that worked under Stalin is still working today, with some cosmetic changes.
But today there is a difference. There are no useful idiots for Prime Minister Putin.
I suppose idiocy is too polite a word for it. It's complete cynicism. The decision to rehabilitate Stalin partially as an excellent manager, personnel manager number one, I suppose you have to agree with that, and as the man who won the war. I think many historians would say that the Russians won the war despite Stalin, not because of him.
As the day of his execution neared, Jones kept his spirits up by singing. His niece remembers the uncle she last saw when she was 10.
I do remember being down at my grandparents' in Barry, and he came in and showed me some photos of starving children. And I thought to myself, how on earth could these fat children, because they had bloated stomachs, how on earth could they be starving if they looked so fat? So I do remember him coming and showing me these pictures.
He sang songs, he sang hymns.
Oh, yes, yes. He did Welsh songs. He loved singing. And he sang David of the White Rock, which is a very famous, rather melodious Welsh song.
Give me a burst of the tune.
Calon lan a dadaioni, calon lan a dadaioni.
That's lovely, that's lovely.
United forever in friendship and labor, our mighty republics will ever...
There's no mistaking the voice of the American singer Paul Robeson. A communist, disgusted by America's oppression of its black minority, Robeson fell hook, line and sinker for Stalin's propaganda machine.
Long live our Soviet motherland.
On return visits to Russia, he'd look up old friends, long since swallowed up into the Gulag. Donald Rayfield.
These people were taken out of prison, given a shave, clean shirt, fed for a few days, shown to Paul Robeson, look, he's alive and well and happy. And when Paul Robeson left, went back to America, back they went to prison and then to death.
Robeson was a true believer.
Well, he was politically very naive, he knew no history, he was a singer. For an American Negro, when you felt a second-class citizen, If as much as second class in your own country, the Soviet Union could put itself forward as a non-racist country in which all could be treated equally, and it was very, very hard for people like Robeson to resist that sort of treatment.
Some useful idiots may not have been bad people, just horribly fooled. But they do not deserve our compassion. Stalin's victims do. The poet Anna Akhmatova once told of how, in the terrible years of the Yezhov terror, she spent 17 months waiting in line outside the prison in Leningrad. Anna said, "Standing behind me was a woman, with lips blue from the cold, who whispered, 'Can you describe this?' And I said, 'I can.' Then something like a smile passed fleetingly over what had once been her face." In that spirit, decades on, another flash of human comedy from Svetlana Stalin, daughter of the tyrant, Richard Ingram's.
Malcolm is sitting in his cosy sitting room in the Sussex countryside with Kitty, and they're having tea with Stalin's daughter. Isn't that bizarre?
How did they get on?
Well, they got on very well to begin with, but Svetlana, who took after her dad in certain ways, had a way of turning against people for no very good reason. They were making a TV programme, of course, and the producer wanted Kitty to show Svetlana round the garden. And Kitty, who was hopeless at that sort of thing, she didn't know what to say and said, "Oh, look at these lovely flowers. Do you have nice flowers in Siberia?" And Svetlana flew into a rage. He said, "Do not talk to me about Siberia."
It's hard to imagine how anyone in the 21st century could repeat the mistakes of the Kremlin's useful idiots. I'll examine that more closely for the BBC's World Service in the next programme. Meanwhile, the last word goes to Professor Donald Rayfield, who sums up the false logic which drives useful idiots into the hands of dictators.
One of the reasons, of course, was that people felt there was only one Satan, and anyone against that particular Satan could not possibly be a devil himself.
Oh, that's tough. You can only deal with one Satan at any one time.
I think that, unfortunately, is something common to most intellectuals and all politicians. So it's this business of feeling that the enemy of your enemy cannot possibly be anything but a friend.
Now, in the second of his two programmes on useful idiots, John Sweeney turns his attention to modern times, and he starts in China.
In April '69, Communist Party delegates assemble for their 9th Congress, Mao's victorious conclusion to the Cultural Revolution. By now he's ousted his opponents, and the shouts of "Long live" are louder than ever.
The sound of tyranny from Mao Zedong's China. This is the second of two programmes on the BBC World Service looking at useful idiots, a loaded term attributed to Lenin. First, a definition, historian Donald Rayfield, and then journalist Bruce Anderson.
It's someone who doesn't think they're an idiot, who thinks they're highly intelligent, but is so easily persuaded by flattery from people in power that they're prepared to serve their purposes and allow themselves to be duped, or even just to lie for the sake of advantage.
Intellectuals have a terrible tendency to adjust the evidence to fit their preconceptions. If they decide they want to believe in something, they will believe in it, and if the evidence says, "Oi, you're wrong," they'll just hit the evidence over the head until it shuts up.
In our democratic age, the world's most populous country still labours under the one-party rule of the Chinese Communist Party. Under the totalitarian rule of Chairman Mao, things were much worse. Correction, under Mao, some say, the East was rosy red. Oliver Cam, leader writer on the London Times.
There were others on the political left, including the liberal left, who did see China as some sort of alternative, efficient and joyous even way of doing things differently. And this was partly a testament to the stupidity of intellectuals, partly a function of the lack of information about China, particularly the terrible details of the Great Famine and then the Cultural Revolution. But above all, it was this recurrent belief among Western intellectuals that because there are imperfections in their own societies, there must be better ways of doing them outside, and alighting on appalling dictatorships as working examples of how to do things differently.
From 1959 to 1961, millions died of famine under Mao's murderous misrule. The evidence, says China expert Jonathan Mirsky, was hard to miss.
If you were just in Hong Kong, you could see in 1960 and 61 huge queues of people outside the post offices in Hong Kong sending food packages up to China where they knew people were starving to death. And the dead bodies of people who had starved to death were floating down the river and arriving in Hong Kong harbor. So this was not a secret. It was only a secret if you didn't want to know.
In the early 70s, Mirsky, as a young academic, went to China on an approved trip. They saw a brilliantly constructed fiction.
This is 1972. Every single school in China was closed because of the Cultural Revolution. We were taken to schools where there were classes, where there were teachers. It looked normal. People were very friendly. Oh, you're Americans. How nice of you to come here.
But the schools, that was all show.
These were Potemkin schools. In Russia, when they wanted the Tsar to think that things were going well, one of his ministers, a man called Potemkin, arranged for certain villages to look good in a certain way. And the word Potemkin has now entered the language as a showplace for people whom the authorities wished to fool. It was very, very easy to do. Why would a dozen people with PhDs believe it when somebody says, there's no crime here? And we all wrote it down in our little notebooks, no crime in China. Afterwards, when I met one of our minders a few years later, when I went back to China, he said, we wanted to put rings in your noses and you helped us put them there.
Finally, Jonathan Mirsky began to glimpse the truth, as he came to see it, about Mao.
He had an enormous impact on China, but he was also a monster, and he made Chinese suffer for years. Let me quote one of Mao's secretaries, a man called Li Rui, about 10 years ago, who was brave enough in his 80s to say Mao liked killing.
How many people did he kill?
I think a better question is how many people died before their time because of Mao. Now, if you take the Great Famine of 1959-61, where the usual estimate, which is careful, is 30 million people. It's the worst man-made famine in history. That was completely down to Mao because of his lunatic policies about how agriculture should be organized and his punishment of people who dared to criticize him. So let's say that 30 million people died before their time in the famine. And let's say that a few million people died during the Cultural Revolution, killed by Red Guards and others. I mean, it's easy to get to 40 million people. Easy.
That didn't seem to worry the British Prime Minister in the early 70s, Edward Heath, who later became a regular visitor to China. Journalist Bruce Anderson.
I'm afraid Edward Heath had a monstrous bladder of vanity. He liked going to China because in China he was treated not barely as a head of government, he was virtually treated as a head of state. He was treated with flattery, with unctuousness, as if he was still in power, as if he was a great man. And I'm afraid he doesn't come out well from that episode. All his critical faculties were overwhelmed. As long as they patted his tummy, he was prepared to roll over like a pet panda.
Tony Benn, veteran socialist and former British politician, lived through the Cold War believing that what mattered in Washington, D.C. was not what kind of monster a ruler was, so long as he was ours. So what did Benn make of Mao?
Mao's role in preventing China from being permanently occupied by the Americans was, I think, a significant role, and I think China's development strategy of going to the countryside and building it up there has played a significant role in building China up as a major power. So I think he would have to rank as a great figure in Chinese history.
Mao was a mass murderer. Surely in the balance, if he's a great man, he's also a great monster too.
I've no doubt that there were aspects of Mao's life and record which I would deeply deplore. But at the same time, you just have to look back on history. How do people look at Napoleon? How do people look at various figures who would have done hideous things but had a significant historical role? One of the aspects of the Cold War was that You were not allowed to think a single good thing about the countries that were your enemies in the Cold War.
Tony Benn has 5 questions to ask any dictator. They're rather good.
What power have you got? Where did you get it from? In whose interest do you exercise it? To whom are you accountable? And how could we get rid of you?
Did you ask